There we go. All right, thanks everyone for being with us this afternoon. My name is Tommy Ferguson. I'm the Executive Director of Capital City Village. For those of you who may not be familiar with what we do, Capital City Village is a local nonprofit, and we work with seniors in the community with a mix of programs and services to help them age well in their own homes for as long as possible. And we do some of that through volunteer services like transportation, minor home fix-its, technology support, etc. And then of course, some really great programs, some social programming, as well as some really interesting and informational programs like we have today. So it is my pleasure to welcome our speaker, Dr. Michele Aynesworth. She's a retired professor of literature and languages and an award-winning translator with degrees or certificates from the University of Texas, Yale, the Sorbonne, and the University of Buenos Aires. Her published translations include an Argentine novel, a French diary from World War II, a considerable work for Yale University Press. For 10 years, she was editor-in-chief of Source, an online publication. Michele's translation of French economist Charles Riest, World War II Diary, Season of Infamy, published by Indiana University Press in 2016, was supported by grants from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Kittredge Foundation. It helped that her first and best reader was her husband, Dan Aynesworth, a former French lecturer at UT Austin. And I wanted to just do a little bit of a setup here. The program today is more of a program about the research effort required to write the translation for the French banker's World War II diary. And there will also be probably a follow-up program that will host that gives more in-depth detail about the contents of that diary. And I think this is, at least in part, a travel log of some of your research adventures. So it is a great opportunity to welcome Michele to our talk today. Thank you so much for putting this together. And I'm going to turn things over to you. Just to let folks know, we will have a question and answer session after Michele goes through her slides and gives her presentation. So please hold your questions until that period. And so right now I'm going to, and please do stay muted until then. I'm going to mute myself, and Michele, take it away.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I'm really excited to be able to share the adventure that Dan and I went through together on this project. Before I get into the personal aspects, which as I say, was an adventure, I want to give you an introduction to Charles Riest, just who was he, and then I'll just list some major themes of the diary as a foretaste of the follow-up presentation, which will actually be about the diary, which is quite dramatic. So who was Charles Riest? He was born in 1874. He died in 1955. He was a financial expert. He wore many hats. He taught economics in various universities. He delivered speeches defending Alfred Dreyfus, who was a Jewish military officer who was falsely accused by higher-ups of giving secrets to the Germans. Riest wrote many articles. He set up a research institute in Paris. He was on the board of numerous banks and organizations. And at one time, he was the sous-gouverneur, the second in command at the Banque de France. That's France's central bank. During World War II, he was in his 60s. He had 5 adult sons with their families. Are you hearing any feedback there? No, okay, good. So his activities, all these enormous activities, were greatly curtailed, and he mostly took care of his adult sons' families, 5 adult sons and their families. But the adult sons, of course, were all engaged either in the war or in related activities. But he made Riest made two important trips just before Germany occupied France. Riest traveled to the United States, where he conferred with Roosevelt and some higher ups in Canada to get an embargo on molybdenum and nickel, which could be used by the Germans to make military equipment. And then during the war, Marshal Pétain, who headed the government, the collaborationist government in Vichy, considered Riest as ambassador to the United States. So this is very interesting. Although in the end, Riest did not do that, he spent several days in the inner circle of Marshal Pétain. And so part of the diary is about that. So for the most part, Riest spent the war caring for this extended family and writing a war diary that was just intended for his family and friends. Part of the concerns that he had for his family, one of his sons was in the French resistance, and one of them was married to a Jewish woman, Françoise, with whom he had 3 children. So Riest had 3 Jewish granddaughters to protect during the war. And after 2 years, I'll just spoiler alert here, he was able to get something I couldn't believe. It's called a certificate of not belonging to the Jewish race. So here are some major themes and topics. I'll just list them that Riest talks about in the diary. It's a play-by-play of the war in Europe. And this was a real education for me because I'm the kind of person, I have avoided reading about wars. I didn't want to hear about them. And with this project, I decided I'm not going to do what translators normally do. I didn't read the whole thing and then go back and translate it. I said, I'm just going to translate this page by page. So I lived through the war with Charles Riest, page by page. He talks about his admiration for America, his hope, and then the long wait for America to intervene finally in the war. And when he gets finally to the point in the diary where America does enter the war, it brought tears to my eyes. It was really moving. He talks about helping and sheltering Jews during the war. He talks about his efforts to save his granddaughters. He has many contemplations that are just wonderful. He was a philosopher, a historian. He was so widely read. And he has amazing analysis and philosophy at various points in the diary. He describes the hardships that were brought about by the Nazi occupation, shortages of clothing, shoes, food, heating, transportation. He talks about the importance of radio communications. He spoke 3 languages. And so he had access to the BBC and various other foreign language radio sources to follow the news of the war. He talks about the French resistance and his son Jean's role in it. And he talks about Marshal Pétain's inner circle, where he was considering being the ambassador to the United States. So that's the introduction to Riest and the diary. And I'm now going to open share screen. I will open my PowerPoint. And there it is.
Slideshow, top.
Yes. So there we go. So translating Charles Riest's wartime diary and rediscovering France. I say rediscovering because I had been a student at the Sorbonne in the early 70s. And so 40 years later, this was a wonderful trip for Dan and me to rediscover France. Dan had lived in the south of France in Béziers once in his life. So in the beginning, Dan Aynesworth was teaching excerpts from Ries's diary in his classes in French at the University of Texas. I retired from teaching at Houston-Tillotson in 2008. And so I was on the lookout for a really good book to translate that I could actually make some money for by finding some grants. And there we are one day in my Aunt Janine's kitchen with Janine and her boyfriend and Dan and me. And Dan is talking about Ries's diary. And suddenly my antenna go up and I said, has that been translated? And he didn't know, but I looked into it. I contacted the French publisher Fayard, and they said, yes, the rights are available. So after 2 years of preliminary translations and presenting the books of proposals, I was awarded an NEA translation grant to do the translation and a grant to do research in Paris. The best part. This is a copy, this is a picture of the French publication. It was published in 1983, about 30 years after Ries's death. And the publication was overseen by Ries's wife, Germaine, who was still alive. And it was edited and published or compiled by Jean-Noël Jeannenet, who was a very close family friend. He had a copy of the manuscript and he wanted to publish it. So André, I was put in touch with André Ries, the oldest grandson of Charles Ries. And André was very excited and he sent me a copy of the French book. It was not available in the United States. So there's a photograph of Ries, Charles Ries. And so thanks to a grant from the Kittredge Foundation, and it did help that Kittredge was mentioned in the diary, Dan and I were able to spend 3 months in Paris in the year 2010 so that I could do research related to the translation. And the main focus of my research was to find the original manuscript. Why? Because there was a mystery. In Jeannenet's note to the French edition, he says, the descendants of Charles Ries wished that certain words or phrases, some 15 lines in all, be omitted. So I'm a lover of detective stories. I said, well, this is it. I'm the detective. I need to find out what that was all about. Did it have something to do with Ries's Jewish daughter-in-law? Where was the manuscript? Well, of course, I asked André, and André was just, oh, well, who knows? He didn't want to tell me right off. So that's one reason I wanted to go there. It's easier to ask somebody a question like that face to face. So there we are. That's Dan in the foreground on the boat. We took to tour the Seine in the heart of Paris. We were in an apartment in the heart of Paris. It was a wonderful experience. Practically the first day that we landed in Paris, we took the train southwest to a sort of faraway suburb called Gif-sur-Yvette. It's actually south of Versailles. Versailles is between Gif and Paris. And so that's a view of the downtown Gif-sur-Yvette, very small village. And our first afternoon, what an amazing experience this was. I found out that they're a very musical family. So by email, before Dan and I even went, we worked out a concert that we put together that first day that we were there in Gif. They sent me some Scottish songs set by Beethoven and Haydn. So I sang. Andre on the left, who's bending over, played the violin. Michele, his wife, in the foreground. There's Dan in the foreground. And their daughter, Marianne, played the cello. And it was great fun. And there we are at a local restaurant having a fabulous French meal. And this was the remains of my magret de canard, wonderful duck dish. My son said I should have taken the photograph before I ate, but oh well. And then we were invited on another occasion early on to meet the family. I was astounded. This was a family reunion. There must have been 30 of them there. In this house belonging to another grandson of Charles Ries, Franklin Ries, named after Franklin Roosevelt. They worshipped Franklin Roosevelt. And so this is in the heart of Versailles. And there also in Versailles, that's a photograph of the house where Charles and his wife Germaine Ries lived with their 5 sons. Ries' study was on the top, the very top of that house, his studio. The house is now owned by a family from Houston, a young couple with their sons. They had lived in Houston, so they have a saddle in their bedroom. I was just fascinated by seeing the indoors of the house. I'll just show you a couple of pictures. This fascinated me. It's in their dining room. It's a food warmer in the radiator. The spiral staircase. And there's me up at the top in Ries' study, caressing his fireplace. I was delighted. This is a view of their backyard where they grew potatoes during the war to survive. So now I move on to where I actually did a lot of the research. A lot of my research was interviewing members of the family and looking for the manuscript. But a lot of it, I went almost every day to the Banque de France, where Ries' papers are housed. It's not your typical US bank. Well, I don't know how to describe it. Anyway, they have a reading room with the papers of Charles Ries. Part of the bank was originally l'Hôtel de Toulouse, a private mansion that was taken over during the French Revolution. I'll tell you more about that. Their gold reserves are stored 7 floors below ground level. So to check in every day, I had to go through airport security. It was like airport security. Ries was I've mentioned he was a sous-gouverneur, the second in command there in the 1920s. And so that's why his papers are housed there. And this gives you some introduction to the labyrinth I went through to get to the reading room. I had to be escorted because, first of all, for security reasons, but I would never have been able to find my way to the reading room. It's a huge, huge series of buildings. And this was the access to Corridor K, which I don't know, for some reason, just struck me as worthy of a literary novel or something. And then you see at the bottom there, across the hall, is the doorway that I just showed you. And here on the other side is the long stairway that leads to the governors who administer the bank. Now I'm going to show you some pictures from inside the bank. It's really amazing. There's the checkered hall with its tapestry, another tapestry. This is the mock-up of the bank. I hope you can see it. It's buildings and buildings and buildings. I don't know how many streets that must cover. This is the Golden Gallery, the WWII, which was a part of the original mansion, the original hotel, that was taken over during the Revolution and lined with this wallpaper, revolutionary wallpaper, and used as a storeroom for paper, which the hotel later became the National Printing Works before ending up as part of the Banque de France. This is the reading room where they would bring me the archives from Charles Ries's papers. Now, another part of our trip, we were invited by Isabelle. Pinar is her last name now. She was one of the Jewish granddaughters. And so she invited us to spend 3 days in her apartment in Saint-Jean-du-Gard in the Cévennes mountains. There's a view from the little balcony at the back of her apartment. Saint-Jean-du-Gard is a commune in the Gard department in southern France. And I think I can show you a map here. Well, I'm sorry, it didn't, oh, it's just slow. It's coming, I think. It's about an hour and a half drive north of Montpellier, that is from the Mediterranean. And it's just northwest of Nîmes.
Probably can't link out to it.
Pardon?
You probably cannot link out to it.
Okay. Anyway, we'll just go on. It's a city of the Cévennes, and it was first mentioned in a 12th century papal bull. So we're going back to the 1100s. Very old city, not a city, I would call it a town. About 4,000 people, I think, is the population. It was very much influenced by Protestantism in the 16th century and became the Mecca of the Camisard resistance after Protestantism was declared illegal. So the Camisard was just a name for the Protestants who were rebelling. Saint-Jean-du-Gard now owes much of its economy to tourism. There's a heritage railway that runs from Saint-Jean-du-Gard to Anduze. And I just learned this preparing for today. I want to take that heritage railway. I want to go back. So here are some quick views of the town of Saint-Jean-du-Gard. This is Isabelle here on the left, coming out of her apartment. Everything very closely built together, very narrow streets, very short, low doorways. There is the Église évangélique de Pentecôte, the Pentecostal Evangelist Church, very near her apartment. And she told us that she identifies as an evangelical Jew. There's Isabelle and Dan standing in one of the streets. It says Rue Générale, Main Street, right. And there's Dan against one of the doorways. Just narrow streets, low doorways. This is, again, a street. Right there in the middle, you can see there's a doorway. So that's an address. Here's a photograph of Charles Riest that is on the doorstep of the house I showed you earlier, where they lived in Versailles. And to his left is André, the eldest grandson, who hosted us on occasion while we were in France. And then the woman next to André is another granddaughter, Sivan. And then the two Jewish granddaughters, Isabelle and Antoinette. That was 1945, the end of the war. Isabelle showed me many things, many portraits, letters, souvenirs that she kept. And this is a self-portrait by her father, Claude Riest. One of the reasons that Charles Riest had to become so involved in protecting the Jewish children and their mother, Françoise, is that the father, Claude, was tubercular and alcoholic. So he had some strong health problems, but I just love this self-portrait he did. And here is Isabelle. I interviewed her, asking her to show me her mother's yellow star, and it's so moving. She also recites the note that her mother had with the yellow star that was left after her death. And the note says, "Je suis fière de porter la honte des Allemands sur mon cœur. I'm proud to wear the Germans' shame on my heart." And I want to show you just a little bit of this.
Bon, Isabelle, cette fois, tu vas me raconter ce que tu sais de cette étoile jaune qu'a portée ta mère.
Alors, cette étoile, au départ, symbolise l'étoile de David, qui est formée par
Symbolizes the Star of
Tu
David.
peux le mettre comme ça, oui.
Voilà, comme ça.
Oui.
Voilà. Alors,
Je vais approcher un peu.
So it says
le drapeau d'Israël
Juif,
porte cette
Jew.
étoile, mais en bleu sur fond blanc. Mais à l'époque, l'État d'Israël n'existait pas. Et les Allemands connaissaient ce symbole. Ils ont voulu démarquer les Juifs et certaines autres ethnies en leur faisant porter le symbole
So
qui
they
est là,
had to wear the
jaune
symbol.
et noir. Pourquoi jaune et pourquoi noir? Ça, je ne sais pas.
Yellow and black.
Mais on a obligé, à partir de 1941, toutes les personnes d'origine juive à porter ça, qu'elles soient croyantes ou pas croyantes.
Whether they were practicing or not, the Jews all had to wear them like that. So I'll cut it there, but very, very powerful interview. So then Isabelle escorted us. I drove, she was our guide for a little tour of the Cévennes. We went up one of the mountains, I believe it was called the Corniche. And this was a trip devoted to memories of resistance. First at the Musée du Désert, which would be translated as the Museum in the Wilderness. This is where the Protestants took refuge when Protestantism was made illegal. Charles Riest, at the end of the war, another very moving for me, the speech he gave at the end of the war at the Museum in the Wilderness. They had an annual assembly and he was invited to speak that year. It was the exact day of Japan's Japan's surrender was formally signed. So it, in effect, marked the end of the war. And a year after, Ries learned that his son Jean had been killed during the German retreat. The theme of his speech was resistance, but with a remarkable twist. He said, "We have suffered during 5 years of arbitrary rule. Vengeance would be natural. Let us resist. Let us leave behind our resentments and resolve to return to the rule of law." So I thought he was such an intelligent person. The whole idea to resist vengeance when so many French people were shaving the heads of young women, for example, if they had had relations with a German officer in order to have food. So on that trip in the Cévennes Mountains, Isabelle guided us to where there was a wonderful monument to resistance. This is a plaque that says in French, "Here in the Cévennes, a land of refuge for the Camisards, French and German fighters," note German fighters also fought in the French resistance. "French and German fighters resisted the occupying Nazi troops, as well as their Vichy collaborators, 1943, 1944. You did not ask for glory or tears, but we owe you remembrance." And this is where I read that plaque. Such a beautiful place for such a monument. And this beautiful rainbow graced the scene when I took my photograph. Now, to the nitty-gritty, the Holy Grail, tracking down the manuscript. I finally learned that this person on the right, Jean-Pierre Ries, had the manuscript. At least probably had the manuscript, because he was adopted by Noel, one of Ries' sons, and he inherited the papers, whatever papers Noel had, and Noel inherited Ries' papers from Germaine. And so I finally got up my courage. I sent him an email. I said, "Would you like to come, with your family for dinner at our apartment?" And a few days passed and I thought, well, he won't answer. And he sent an email and he said, "Well, we would like for you and Dan to come have dinner with us." And so we did. There's Jean-Pierre on the right, his wife from Cameroon on the left. And there, she was 3 years old at the time, Sophie. And we had a wonderful Cameroon style dinner. And I'm waiting still with bated breath. Does he have the manuscript? Does he have the manuscript? So he finally brought out the manuscript, because I had said, well, maybe if you have the manuscript, that would be nice. Sure enough, after dinner, he brings out this box with this airplane style stationery, like 400 pages. That was the diary. And so he puts the box on the table. Little Sophie jumps up on the table. There are drinks and food, and I'm having a heart attack. And finally I said, "Would you like to go sit on the couch with Dan?" And so we got past that. Here is a sample page from the diary, written front and back on personal stationery. You can see, I think, how thin that paper is. And you can imagine how hard it is to read the handwriting, because it's a particular French style of writing, and it's very tiny. So I was so happy to find the manuscript. Jean-Pierre was very kind. He allowed me to return another day. I photographed every page of the diary. So I have that in my computer. So I could enlarge portions of the manuscript to try to read them if I wanted. The passages that had been omitted, and it seems that it was Germaine probably who marked these passages in red. They were marked in red, so they weren't hard to, to spot. So this is just a sample from October 1943. Françoise, so this is something Charles Ries wrote in the diary that was not published in the French edition. Françoise was summoned by the Gestapo in Maison Lafitte on Tuesday for an interrogation regarding 2 denunciations that had been received against her. One accused her of not wearing her yellow star. The other of traveling between Le Vésinet, where she lived, and Paris. I, Charles Ries, went with her so she wouldn't have to face these worrisome characters alone. But I was not allowed to be present at the interrogation. I had to wait in the hall. After she came out, she told me she had been able to clear herself on all points. She'd signed a record of the interview and was told that she'd be summoned again once her statements had been checked. Now, this is a whole can of worms related to the diary. It doesn't reflect, but now I know what I know. I see in it what hinted at conflict. Some of the, at least 2, I think, of the Jewish granddaughters believe that it was Germaine, Charles Ries' wife, who denounced Françoise. Who knows? But they were also suspicious that Françoise had to go in alone to be with these Nazi officers, and somehow she cleared herself on all points. So it raises lots of questions that I have no answers for. So finally, 2016, Indiana University Press published the diary. I was thrilled because they did such a wonderful job. They put in everything I had included, and it was a lot, including appendices. I liked this review I saw today by Brett Bowles. It's listed on Amazon. Much of the diary's critical value comes from Ries's unique perspective generated by his exceptional access to information, his fluency in 3 languages, and his rare ability to analyze current events in a long-term historical and intellectual perspective. And then another note I have here at the bottom is about the title. The French title is Une saison gâtée. Now that title was given to the diary by the French editor, Jeannet. Ries didn't have chapters. He didn't have a title for the diary. He would just put 1945. So that's one of the things I did when I organized the diary. I have chapters and introductions to the chapters. So the title in French, Une saison gâtée, a corrupt season, literally, was translated as Season of Infamy, to echo Roosevelt's unforgettable denunciation of the attack on Pearl Harbor. So I'm thankful for that title. One day, Dan and a friend of ours from Argentina, Ray McKay, and I sat down and tossed the football back and forth. And it was Ray actually who suggested using the word infamy. I thought that was great. So I'm just going to give you 4 short excerpts from the diary to give you a taste of how he writes, and that will conclude my presentation. This is the first entry in the diary. It's a vivid description of the exodus from Paris as the Germans invaded France. September 2nd, 1939. We set off early to visit our son Jean in Moulins. Cars full of children and suitcases with mattresses on the roof. Crowds at Nevers, crowds at Moulins, but we found a room at Jean's hotel, Jean, their son, across from the railroad station. He showed up at 7:30, happy to see us. What a great surprise. Dinner in the dining room with officers everywhere. Jean, plain spoken and unassuming, talking quite openly about everything. His job is to shoe the horses for 4 regiments, and he's amazed by the detailed instructions given to him in a little notebook. The military command foresaw all, except the fact that horses from the Bourbonnais region have hooves that do not fit any of the 3 regulation sizes. So I thought that was great. You know, it starts in the midst of this chaos with a touch of humor. Here's an excerpt from February 1941, talking about the hardships. The difficulties in getting supplies have created a whole system of private shipments from the countryside to the city. Here, packages of 2, 3, and 5 kilos containing butter, beans, and canned goods are piling up at the station. The cold of the last few days and the heavy snow have slowed down distribution. Our small supply of coal, excuse me, is running low. Each new freeze means we must light the stove again. Then as soon as the temperature rises above 32 degrees, we hurriedly turn it off. The trains have been cut back, and a shortage of lubricants is expected in a few weeks. Dr. Veslot tells us that for every 50,000 bottles of Gallia milk produced, the Germans take 45,000. The rest, haha, is for French babies. This is an example of Riest's introspections. This is from April 1941. Here, in the powerless state in which we find ourselves, there is a strong sense that we are no more than phantoms. One comes, one goes, one attends to business, but in a world that no longer seems real. From all that really lives, all that thinks, hopes, vibrates with normal human feelings, we are cut off. Our world is covered by a lid, underneath which the only air we have to breathe is contaminated by the falsification of all news, of all ideas, where good is called evil. Boy, this is striking home with me. Honor, shame, where what we do no longer has a clear goal, where the future, like the past, is cut off from us. Only the most elementary human acts and solidarity in the hope of one day getting out of this prison have meaning anymore. And a taste of joy at the end of the war. This is August 1944. Paris is delirious with joy. General de Gaulle appeared on the balcony of the Hôtel de Ville and needed only to shout, "Vive la France." This day crowns one of the grandest and most beautiful efforts that a man has ever made to raise his country up from humiliation. The whole country is cheering him today. So I'm back. And that's the end.
Thank you, Michele. That was really incredible. I mean, gosh, what an in-depth look at some, not just the person's life, but the context within which they were living, the context of war, and that unique perspective that he had because of his access, because of his influence, and because of their family circumstance. How pivotal it was for them. That really must have been fascinating to research.
It was such an education for me, I have to say.
Wow. All right, well, I am going to open it up for questions. So I'm going to scan along here and just see if you have any questions. I'm going to scan and just see. You can use the raise hand function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Or if you-
Barbara's raising her question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Barbara.
Yeah, I'm wondering how much preparation you were able to do before you ever got to France? Or did you have to just take it when you got there and continue to develop it?
What sort of preparation are you thinking of?
Well, you got to meet these different people and get involved with them. Was that all done after you got to France, or were you able to do a lot of the scouting and research ahead of time?
I guess I was mostly devoted to the translating before we went to do the research. So I was working with Dan, you know, he was my best reader, as I said, to just translate, going through the diary. And I would say my primary concern before I went to Paris was to do a good translation. That was what I was focused on.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I'll continue to scan, but a question occurs to me too.
Tom, of course.
Oh, I'm sorry. Then Tom, please go ahead and unmute.
Sure. Vocabulary, was what he wrote to words that were easily to recognize, or did you have to, in a sense, extrapolate a little bit on some of the vocabulary?
I'll tell you what the hardest part was. You know, he was an expert economist. And part of the diary I didn't mention has to do with the finances and the economic crises. He also was still involved in running his research institute and you know, on a low level with the bank that he was involved with. Actually, he was on the boards of several banks still. And so the economic terms in French sometimes threw me for a loop. But another grandson of, grandson, yes, of Charles Reist, Franklin, I did show you his, looked like a haunted house to me. But anyway, that house in Versailles where we had a family reunion. Franklin is he's well advanced in years like most of us now, but he lives in Paris. He's a lawyer. And I would email Franklin and say, Franklin, can you please find out for me what the heck this means? And so he at least knew people to ask, and that helped a lot. Yeah.
That's pretty interesting. I'm going to scan here too to see if there are any other questions, but I'm curious in the meantime, when you were doing sort of the preparation for this program and going back through some of your research and some of the documentation, were you struck at all by sort of the things going on in the world, the foreign activities currently, and how, I mean, it makes me wonder, you know, what will capture the story of the common lives and the people that are, you know, going through an invasion, a possible occupation. I just wonder what sort of, you know, remnants of that experience will endure such that their stories are actually really available to people in the future.
Well, I think what I got from your question is what resonates with me for the present. And you brought up Ukraine, of course, which is a question of occupation right now. But as I was reading that excerpt, which I added just this morning to the presentation, where Charles Reist is meditating on this lived, you know, I'm thinking, yeah, 2 years of COVID to start with. And then he talks about the false information, you know, the disinformation. And I think, yeah, we've seen some of that too. So yeah, a lot of it. And one of the things in the diary from an economic point of view, he favored the gold standard. And I understand there's still debate about whether we should be on a gold standard. So lots of questions from his time still remain to be answered. The discrimination, the anti-Semitism, that hasn't gone away. So
certainly some parallels to our current
absolutely,
time.
yeah.
Yeah. I'm going to scan really quickly if there are any other questions, if you want to just raise your hand or chime in.
I just want to say hello to Jane Lipman. Jane, I don't know if you remember me. I was Michele Gracie and then married McKay and then Aynesworth. I was one of your students once upon a time in the French department.
Oh,
Oh, Jane, you're muted, but feel free to chime in. You'll need to unmute.
I was wondering, how did he manage to save the 3 Jewish grandchildren?
Well, you raise a really interesting question. Before I had even gone to France, I was working on the translation. And I got this phone call. And this man says, "Are you the one translating that collaborationist diary?" And I'm, what? Excuse me? That was the last thing that would occur to me, that anybody would call Charles Rees a collaborator. But evidently, some critics looked at Charles Rees, who was walking that fine line of responsibilities and having to work to a certain extent with the enemy, not the enemy really, but the collaborationist government, Pétain. He had to maintain some ties there. And that is how eventually he got that certificate that saved his 3 grandchildren. So, one thing I learned from this is how complicated life can be and how easy and wrong it is to just point the finger at someone when they do something you don't like, unless you know the big picture. But does that answer your question?
Yeah. So they were able to live right out in the open with that paper.
Yes, and I think it had to do with somehow, I think they got a Baptist minister to say that he had baptized those children. Their mother, Françoise, was not a practicing Jew. She did attend, I don't know if she attended a Christian church, but anyway, the children did. But they weren't baptized. But Rees got, first of all, a cooperating Baptist minister, I believe it was, to say that he had baptized them as Christians. And then it took 2 years of string pulling for Rees to get those certificates.
Yeah, that part is really fascinating. And that you were able to meet and spend time with one of the granddaughters that was that benefited from that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question. Yeah, you were working on the translation before you went to France. How different was what you were working from the original that you saw when you got to the grandson's apartment?
Yeah, I think it was very faithful. I think the French publication by Jean Denet was very faithful to the manuscript. It's just that he respected Germaine Charles' wife passages that she marked that she did not want published. And these had to do, it became clear to me, they had to do with friction. There was friction for sure between Françoise, the Jewish mother, and Charles and Germaine. One example of that is Françoise wanted to send the granddaughters, the three young women, the girls, in a caravan to the south of France. She thought that would be the safest thing for them. Charles Rees, as I said, the father, Claude, had health problems. He was not really part of the picture. So Charles Rees took over the role as the father figure, and he put his foot down. He said, no, that's very dangerous. She must stay here. So there's a point of friction. And then something about Françoise was denounced by somebody for not wearing the yellow star. And that was one of those damned if you do and damned if you don't things. But whoever denounced her, if there was a good motive for doing it, it was if Germaine did that. The only motive I can think of is that she was afraid that it would cause problems for the whole family if Françoise were arrested. I don't know. But anyway, that's the only thing that Jean Genet, he did leave out some passages relating to this friction. And he was open about, he didn't say what they were about, but he did say some passages have been left out.
Looks like Barbara has a question.
Yeah. Is the manuscript, the original manuscript, in a safer place now?
That's a wonderful question. I worried about that. Jean-Pierre really doesn't seem to be all that interested, but I told him, I said, look, I'm gonna purchase, this was right at the end of our trip, so I didn't have a lot of time. I said, I'm gonna purchase some special boxes to put them in that are designed to preserve paper, I guess is the basic idea. So I found a place in Paris, I purchased the boxes, and I just had time to email Jean-Pierre and I said, the boxes have been paid for, they're at this address, please go pick them up. And I never heard another word from him. So at least I have photographs of all the pages of the manuscript.
This is Carol Carl. I'm slightly curious because you seem very offended that somebody called him a collaborationist. But I remember having been a student in France that after the war and with the family I live with, she said, oh, you mustn't ever talk about it. Everybody now is part of the French underground. But it doesn't sound like he had any role in it at all. So I'm just curious if he did.
If he had any role in the resistance, is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Yeah, that comes up in the diary. His son Jean was in the resistance. And he talks in the diary about how he got a visit one day from members of the resistance. And they wanted him to, I'm not sure, I guess advise them, counsel them, I'm not sure what. They wanted him to officially participate in the resistance somehow. And I think in a way he sort of, brushed off the question and said, oh, well, you can't imagine, I'm in my 60s, what do you want? You want me to go to Algeria? That sort of response. But after they, this is then just his reflections on the whole thing. He had his questions about what the resistance was doing, actually, because Charles Rees and the official resistance was one thing, but resistance, members of the resistance who would just go shoot down a Nazi officer or something. And then there would be reprisals. I forget there's an actual incident in the diary of this, that the resistance had performed some bloody act, and there was a terrible counter attack from the Nazis. So this was one of the questions Reist had about that.
Thank you. I'll be very curious to read the diary. I have a feeling I'm on the side of the collaborationist.
You're an undecided.
No, I'm not. I'm undecided at the moment. I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. But it doesn't sound like he did. From all the folks that I knew, anybody who got to that high a position was more interested in saving their family. And it doesn't sound like he was so concerned. If he was a close buddy of Pétain, I'm very interested in.
He was not a close buddy. I need to clarify that. He was not a close buddy of Pétain. He went, but his descriptions of Pétain and his inner circle are just scathing.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And he sheltered a Jewish family in their, they had a retreat near Switzerland, Evian, I think it was, where one of the Jewish families they knew stayed there during the whole war. He had, in my research at the Banque de France, I couldn't put this in the diary, but I read many letters from Jews and other refugees who wanted him to help them. I didn't see the responses, although I saw some thank you notes. So, you know, he didn't keep his letters to them, but it seems pretty clear that he was known as someone who was ready to help.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Michelle,
Yes. Hi.
this is Jane. This
Yes.
isn't a question, but I want to thank you personally for your excellent presentation and for all the hard work that went into it.
Oh,
As
thank
an
you.
aside, I must say that to me, it's always very exciting and fun to see former students years after they have been in my classroom and to see how much they have accomplished.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Jane. Yeah.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, it was quite a labor of love. And Carol asked me about, yeah, that was really, it tickled me actually that you said, well, you seemed offended that he was called the collaborationist. But they say never fall in love with your author, but I did. So yeah, that's true.
This has been a wonderful presentation. So unless there are any other questions, we will let you go. Thank you so much. This was really intriguing. I had no idea, but I love the degree of research and the devotion that you had to this project. It really shows, and it sounds really fascinating. And I would love, yes, for you to come back and actually do a deeper dive on the contents of the diary and sort of bring out all of the different details that we didn't receive. But I think this was an absolutely wonderful prelude to it, and to talk about the research process and the task and the collaboration clearly that went into it. It's really amazing.
Don't use that word.
Oh, well, I will say, I thought it was very impressive.
Thank you so much. It was just wonderful to have the chance to get back into it.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you so much, Michelle.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.